In the blistering heat of the desert, a small frontier town struggled to survive. The sun beat down relentlessly, casting long shadows across the dirt streets. Dust swirled in the air as horses trotted through the town, their hooves clopping against the uneven ground. The town was a mix of settlers, traders, and gamblers, all trying to make their way in a harsh world. Among them, moving quietly through the crowd, was Ayanna, a young Apache woman with dark eyes that spoke of a history filled with hardship. Ayanna had been living in the shadows for as long as she could remember. Her people, the Apache, were known for their strength, their fierce independence, and their deep connection to the land. But that history had led to their downfall in the white man's world. She was one of the few remaining Apache who hadn't been forced onto a reservation, yet she was treated like a ghost, unseen and unheard. She had wandered from town to town looking for work or food, always rejected, always turned away. People would see her dirty clothes and her rough, tanned face, and they would look the other way, pretending they hadn't noticed her. That morning, Ayanna had returned to the same town she'd passed through a few months before. The promise of a warm meal or a kind word had pulled her back. But as she moved down the dusty street, the familiar feeling of loneliness crept in. She was an outsider, someone who didn't belong in a world where people like her were looked down upon. Her stomach growled with hunger as she walked past a group of men gathered outside a saloon. They were talking loudly, their voices carrying over the noise of the street. She had grown used to the laughter and the whispers that followed her wherever she went. It was as if her very presence was an insult to the people who lived in this town. But today, something was different. There was a man standing at the edge of the crowd, his posture relaxed but confident. His rough cowboy hat was pushed back, and his brown eyes scanned the town, taking in the sights and sounds as if he had seen it all before. The man was Jake, a cowboy who had just finished a long cattle drive across the desert. His hands were calloused from years of working with the animals, and his face was lined with the kind of toughness that only came from surviving the harshness of the frontier. He had seen too many things in his life to be shocked by much, but when his eyes fell on Ayanna, something stirred inside him. She stood at the edge of the crowd, her shoulders hunched as she held out her hand asking for any help the townspeople might offer. Jake wasn't sure why he was drawn to her. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, so quiet, so resigned to the life she led. Or maybe it was the fact that she seemed to be the only person in this God-forsaken town who hadn't given up. He had spent enough time in places like this to know that most people were only out for themselves. But this woman, this Apache woman, looked like someone who had lived through a storm and was still standing tall. He pushed his way through the crowd, his boots scraping against the dusty ground. The men looked at him curiously, but he ignored them. When he reached Ayanna, he stopped just short of her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. She didn't flinch or look away. Instead, she simply stared back as if she had grown used to being invisible. "How much do you need?" Jake asked, his voice rough but not unkind. Ayanna blinked in surprise. She wasn't used to people speaking to her directly, let alone offering help. She glanced down at her hand, still extended, and then back up at Jake. His offer seemed strange, like a dream that might disappear if she reached out for it. But the hunger gnawing at her stomach pushed aside her doubts. I don't know," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Anything would be enough." Jake looked her over, taking in her weathered appearance and the tattered clothes that hung from her thin frame. There was a sadness in her eyes that made something tighten in his chest. He didn't have much to give, but there was something about her that made him want to do more. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a $100 bill, holding it out to her. "Marry me for this," he said, his voice steady. The words hung in the air, and for a moment Ayanna didn't understand. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was offering. She had heard of marriages being arranged for land or cattle, but never for money in such a casual manner. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she could feel the eyes of the men around her. Some of them were staring, others were whispering, but Jake's gaze remained fixed on her. "Marry me for $100, Jake repeated, his expression unreadable. "I don't have much to offer, but I could use a wife." Ayanna took a step back, confusion and disbelief flashing across her face. This wasn't the way things were supposed to happen. Marriage was supposed to be a sacred bond, something built on trust and love, not an exchange of money. She had never imagined her life could come to this, but what choice did she have? She had nothing. And this stranger was offering her something more than she had ever dreamed of. She looked down at the $100 bill in his hand. It was more money than she had seen in her entire life. For a moment she thought about the life she could have. With that money she could buy food, clothes, and maybe even a little peace. But then a thought hit her. Was this the life she had imagined for herself? To be nothing more than a wife for hire? She hesitated, unsure of what to do. The silence stretched on, and Jake's patience seemed to wear thin. Look, I don't know what you're running from, but I'm offering you a chance. A roof over your head, food to eat, and a way out of this town, he said. You don't have to love me. Just stay with me. It's a deal. Take it or leave it. Ayana's heart raced. She wasn't used to making decisions like this, but the prospect of a better life was too tempting to ignore. She took a deep breath, swallowed her pride, and nodded. Okay, she said, her voice barely audible. I'll marry you. Jake didn't smile, but his expression softened. He handed her the $100 bill, and for the first time in a long while, Ayana felt something stir inside her, a mixture of hope, fear, and the faintest flicker of curiosity about the man who had just changed her life. Jake's small ranch was far outside the town, nestled in the vast open land that stretched out for miles, with the distant mountains rising like silent sentinels in the background. The air was dry and filled with the smell of sagebrush and dust. When Ayana first saw the place, she wasn't sure what to think. It was a simple house built from weathered wood surrounded by a few small structures, likely a barn and a shed for the animals. There was no sign of luxury here, no grand buildings, but there was something about the quiet of the place that felt different from the bustling town. She followed Jake down a narrow dirt path to the house, her feet dragging with every step. She wasn't sure what kind of life awaited her, but she knew it wasn't going to be easy. Ayana had lived through hardships before, but this was something else. She was now tied to a man she barely knew, a man who had bought her with a $100 bill. Jake opened the door, and they stepped inside. The room was small but surprisingly cozy. A fire crackled in the hearth, sending a warm glow across the room. A table, a few chairs, and some shelves filled with supplies made up the majority of the space. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had ever had. Make yourself at home, Jake said, his voice gruff but not unkind. I'll get you some food. Ayana stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to do. She didn't feel like she belonged here, yet she knew she had no other choice. She set her things down by the door, still clutching the $100 bill in her hand like it was some kind of lifeline. As Jake moved about the kitchen, gathering food, Ayana took a seat at the table, looking around the room. She had never been inside a settler's home before. The furniture was simple, the walls lined with practical tools and supplies. There was a small window that looked out over the land, where the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden light over the field. It was a peaceful sight, and for the first time since she had come to the town, Ayana felt a flicker of calm. Jake brought over a plate of food, simple fare, bread, beans, and some dried meat. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had eaten in days. She hesitated for a moment before picking up the fork. She had never been one to accept charity, but this was different. She was here because of a deal. There was no kindness in this arrangement, no expectations of gratitude. She had agreed to marry him for $100, and that was all it was. Jake sat across from her, eating his meal in silence. He didn't try to make conversation or look at her directly. Ayana appreciated that. She wasn't ready for small talk or questions. She didn't want to explain herself. She wasn't even sure how to explain why she had agreed to this strange arrangement. As they ate, the silence between them grew more comfortable. It was a quiet kind of tension, not born of animosity, but of the understanding that they were both unsure of what to do next. They were strangers, bound together by a contract that neither fully understood. After dinner, Jake took the dishes and washed them without a word. Ayana helped as best as she could, but her hands were unfamiliar with the work. She wasn't used to this kind of life. No one had taught her how to keep house, how to care for animals, how to do anything other than survive. But she was willing to try. She had to. Jake's silence was something she had to get used to. He wasn't unkind, but he wasn't warm either. His presence was steady, reliable, but there was no lightness to him. It was as if he carried a weight that she couldn't see, and maybe she didn't need to understand it. Maybe, she thought, that was how people survived out here in the West, by keeping their feelings close, by not letting anything get too close. Later that evening, they went outside to look at the stars. The sky was clear, with no clouds to hide the millions of pinpricks of light scattered across the dark canvas. Ayanna stood beside Jake, her eyes lifted to the sky, feeling the cool air on her skin. It felt different here. In the wide open, surrounded by nothing but the land and the stars, it was quieter than anything she had ever known, and for a moment, she wondered if she could find peace here. Jake didn't say anything as he stood next to her, but she could feel the unspoken thoughts between them. This was their new life now. She had agreed to marry him, and he had agreed to take her in. But what did that mean? What did it mean to be married to a man who barely knew her, and who wasn't asking for anything more than a partnership of necessity? Ayanna didn't know the answer. She only knew that she had made this choice, and now she had to live with it. She had no family left, no one to turn to. The world outside this quiet ranch was too dangerous, too unkind. She was safer here, with Jake, even if their relationship was built on an agreement, not love. As the night grew darker and the cold air seeped into her bones, Ayanna felt a strange sense of comfort. There was no pressure here, no expectations. Jake hadn't asked anything of her other than her presence. And though the arrangement was strange, it wasn't the worst thing that had ever happened to her. Jake turned to her after a while, his voice low. "You can stay here as long as you want. I'm not asking for anything from you except to be here." Ayanna nodded. She didn't know what to say. There was no promise of love, no promise of a fairy tale, but there was a sense of security she hadn't felt in years, and that, she realized, was enough for now. They went back inside, and Ayanna made a small bed for herself by the fire. Jake went to his own room, and though they were under the same roof, there was still a distance between them. Ayanna lay down, her thoughts racing, but eventually the exhaustion of the day took over, and she fell into a deep sleep, wondering what the future would hold. Would this life be enough? Would this strange partnership grow into something more? Or was she simply here to survive, to get by, and nothing more? For now, she didn't have the answers. All she had was the quiet of the night, the steady presence of Jake, and the uncertain promise of what was to come. Days turned into weeks, and life at the ranch settled into a rhythm that neither Ayanna nor Jake had expected. The early awkwardness between them began to fade, replaced by a quiet understanding. Ayanna spent most of her time helping with the chores, feeding the chickens, collecting firewood, and tending to the garden. Though she wasn't used to this kind of work, she found herself growing stronger and more capable with each passing day. She had learned to endure hardship in her past, but this life was different. It wasn't about survival anymore. It was about living. Jake, for his part, continued with his work on the ranch. He would ride out in the mornings to check on the cattle, and by the time he returned, the sun was low in the sky. Ayanna noticed that he rarely spoke about his past, and when she asked, his responses were brief and evasive. He didn't share much, and she respected that. It was clear that there was something heavy on his heart, but it wasn't something he wanted to talk about. Their interactions were simple. He would come home, and they would share a meal, often in silence, only the sound of utensils clinking against the plates filling the quiet room. They had yet to speak of the terms of their marriage, an arrangement that neither of them fully understood. But as time went on, Ayanna began to notice small changes. Jake's demeanor softened around her. He began to ask how she was doing, if she needed anything, though his tone was always guarded. It was clear that neither of them was ready to trust fully, but there was a quiet bond forming between them, built on the understanding that neither had come into this situation with high expectations. Ayanna had always believed that the world was harsh and unforgiving. She had grown up among the Apache, living a life of freedom and strength, but that world had been destroyed by the coming of settlers and soldiers. The survival skills she had honed in her youth had kept her alive, but they had also made her hard, guarded against the world, afraid of being hurt again. Yet in this small, quiet life with Jake, she found herself questioning that belief. She had seen kindness in him, a gentleness she hadn't expected from a man like him. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jake came to her as she worked in the garden. He stood at the edge of the garden, watching her with a thoughtful expression. "Ayanna," he said, his voice carrying on the evening breeze. "I need to tell you something." She paused, wiping her brow with the back of her hand. It was rare for him to speak with such seriousness, and the sudden shift in his tone caught her attention. She turned to face him, waiting. I'm not good with this kind of thing." he began, his words slow, almost hesitant. "I've never had to share much with anyone. But I think you should know that. I didn't bring you here to make your life harder." Ayanna frowned slightly, unsure of what he meant. She had been working so hard every day, not thinking about much beyond getting through each task. But now, standing before her, Jake seemed vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "I know we agreed to this marriage, and I know it was just for survival," he continued, his eyes not meeting hers. "But I'm grateful you're here. I didn't expect you to stay, but you did. And I think I'm starting to care about you." His words caught Ayanna off guard. She had never expected to hear them from him. Not after the way their marriage had begun, not after everything that had happened between them. She had never allowed herself to believe that something good could come from a life built on such an unexpected foundation. She searched his face for any sign that he might be saying this out of obligation, but there was nothing there except sincerity. "I didn't expect to care either," she admitted quietly, her gaze falling to the dirt beneath her feet. "But it's hard not to, with you being so kind even when I don't deserve it." Jake stepped closer, his boots crunching softly on the ground. He gently lifted her chin so that their eyes met. "Ayanna, you deserve better than you think. And I'm not asking for anything from you. I just want you to know that I'm not treating you like an agreement anymore." Her heart raced as his words sank in. For the first time since they had met, she felt a real connection to him, something more than the arrangement that had brought them together. She didn't know what to say. She didn't know how to respond to the emotions that stirred inside her. Before she could speak, Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bundle of dried herbs. He handed them to her with a smile. "I thought you might like these," he said, his voice soft. "They're from the mountains. I've been thinking about how much you enjoy the garden, and I figured you could add these to the herbs you grow." Ayanna took the bundle, touched by his gesture. She had never expected him to be so thoughtful. The small kindness felt like a quiet promise that maybe, just maybe, this life they were building together could be more than just survival. The next few days passed with a newfound sense of peace between them. Jake continued his work on the ranch, and Ayanna worked in the garden, planting the herbs Jake had given her. As the seasons began to change, so did their relationship. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but little by little they began to trust each other. They spent more time talking, sharing stories of their pasts. Jake spoke of the harsh world he had grown up in, and Ayanna told him of the Apache ways, of the people she had lost and the strength she had carried with her. It wasn't easy for either of them, but it felt right. As the months passed, Ayanna's pregnancy became more apparent. She had known for a while, but it wasn't until her belly began to round that she truly understood the depth of the change that was coming. She wasn't just carrying a child. She was carrying their future. And for the first time, she felt a sense of hope that she hadn't felt in years. Jake noticed it too. He would place his hand on her growing belly as they sat together in the evenings, a gesture that at first felt foreign, but soon became natural. He never spoke much about the child, but his actions spoke louder than any words could. He was there for her in every way he could be, whether it was fetching water from the well or making sure she was comfortable as the weather grew colder. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars, Ayanna spoke softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jake, I'm scared." He turned to her, concern in his eyes. "Scared of what?" "Scared of what happens next," she said, her hand resting on her belly. "Scared of what kind of world I'm bringing this child into." Jake looked at her for a long moment, then reached out and took her hand in his. "It's a hard world, Ayanna, but you don't have to face it alone. We'll face it together. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." In that moment, Ayanna felt a quiet peace settle over her. For the first time, she believed him. As the days grew shorter and the cold of winter began to creep in, Ayanna and Jake's bond continued to strengthen. They were no longer just a woman and a man who had made a deal. They were partners, friends, and soon they would be parents. And though neither of them knew what the future held, they had something more precious than they had ever expected: each other. The winter months seemed to stretch on forever, with the cold wind biting through the walls of their small home. Snow often covered the ground, turning the world outside into a blanket of white, while inside the ranch the fire crackled and popped, its warmth a small comfort against the harshness of the season. Ayanna and Jake had settled into a rhythm of daily life. the quiet work of survival binding them together in ways neither could have anticipated when they first met. Ayanna had grown more comfortable with the chores of the ranch. The garden she had started in the spring had flourished, and she spent hours tending to the plants, ensuring that the roots were strong and the leaves bright. She even took pleasure in the small things, like the sound of water flowing from the well or the way the chickens clucked happily when she fed them. It was a quiet life, but it was hers. And for the first time, she found herself feeling a sense of pride in what she had accomplished, despite the difficult circumstances. Jake, too, had adjusted to the new life. He had always been a solitary man, but there was something about Ayanna that softened him. She was not like the women he had known in the past. She was strong, capable, and had a quiet determination that spoke to him in a way that words never could. It wasn't just the fact that she had agreed to marry him for $100. It was the way she carried herself, the way she worked alongside him, never complaining, always doing what needed to be done. He found himself respecting her more with each passing day, and that respect grew into something deeper, something he wasn't sure he understood at first. But even as their bond grew stronger, life on the ranch wasn't without its challenges. The cold made everything harder. Water had to be hauled from the well, and firewood had to be chopped and stacked high to keep the house warm. Some days, it felt like the world outside was trying to freeze them in place, trapping them in the small space they had carved out for themselves. And then, of course, there was the matter of the pregnancy. As Ayanna's belly grew, so did the worries in her heart. She had been pregnant before in another life, but that had ended in loss. This time the child was alive, and that brought both hope and fear. Ayanna spent long hours sitting by the fire, her hand resting on her belly, thinking about the future. She didn't know what kind of world her child would grow up in. The world outside the ranch was still full of danger and uncertainty. There were people in town who had never accepted her for who she was, and there were whispers of violence and unrest between the settlers and the indigenous people. She feared for her child, knowing that they would grow up in a world that might not accept them for their mixed heritage. Jake, noticing the quiet weight of her thoughts, tried his best to comfort her. He would sit with her by the fire, his hand on hers, offering her silent support. He didn't have the answers, but he would always be there for her, just as he had promised. He had never thought he would have a family, much less a child. But now that the reality of it was settling in, he couldn't imagine life without Ayanna and the baby. He was determined to protect them both no matter what. One evening, as the wind howled outside, Jake came in from the barn, his face red from the cold. He pulled off his boots and hung his coat by the door before sitting down across from Ayanna. The fire crackled between them, casting flickering shadows on the walls. "Things are getting harder out there," Jake said, his voice low and serious. "The snow's piled up pretty high. I'll need to go into town tomorrow to get supplies." Ayanna nodded, her eyes focused on the fire. "It's always harder this time of year. But you're strong, Jake. You'll make it." He smiled at her, the warmth of her words offering him more comfort than he let on. But there was something else in his gaze, a quiet concern. "I know it's not easy being here alone all the time. I don't want you to feel like you're stuck. If you want to go back to town, you can. I'll understand." Ayanna's heart tightened at his words. The offer was kind, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Despite the hardships they faced, despite the uncertainty, this was where she had found some semblance of peace. "I'm not going anywhere," she said softly, her voice steady. "I don't belong in town anymore. This is my home now." Jake's eyes softened and he stood up, moving over to where she sat. He gently placed his hand on her shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Then we'll face whatever comes together, Ayanna. You're not alone in this." The days grew shorter as winter continued to tighten its grip on the ranch. But with each passing day, the bond between Ayanna and Jake deepened. Their conversations, once sparse, became more frequent and meaningful. They spoke of their pasts, their hopes for the future, and their growing expectations for the child they would soon welcome into the world. Ayanna learned that Jake had lost his family to a fever when he was young, and that the loneliness he had felt since then had shaped him into the man he was. He had never let anyone get close, never allowed himself to rely on anyone for fear of losing them. But with Ayanna, something had changed. He didn't know what it was, but he knew that he couldn't imagine life without her in it. As Ayanna's due date drew closer, she became more and more anxious. The fear of losing the baby again gnawed at her, and the thought of the pain she might face weighed heavily on her mind. She had lived through so much, had endured loss in ways that few could understand. But now, with Jake by her side, she felt a new kind of strength. He was there for her, steady and unwavering, and that gave her the courage to face whatever lay ahead. One afternoon, as Ayanna sat by the fire, a sharp pain hit her abdomen. It was sudden, and the pain took her by surprise. She gasped, clutching her belly, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. Jake, who had been out in the barn, heard her cry out and rushed inside. "Ayanna!" he called, his voice frantic.
"What's wrong?"
She could barely speak, the pain was so intense. But she reached out to him, and he quickly knelt by her side, his hands on her shoulders, trying to comfort her. "It's okay," he said, his voice trembling. "We're going to get through this together." With his steady presence beside her, Ayanna drew in a shaky breath. The pain began to subside, but her heart still raced in her chest. She couldn't let fear take over. She had to stay strong for the baby, for Jake, for herself. Jake held her close, never letting go until the pain passed. When it was over, he gently helped her to her feet, his hands steady and reassuring. "You're not alone, Ayanna," he whispered. "Not now, not ever." In that moment, Ayanna realized something deep within herself. No matter what happened, she was no longer just a woman trying to survive. She was part of something bigger now, a family, a partnership, a life that she had built with Jake. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. And that in itself was enough. As the months passed, the weight of winter began to ease. The days grew longer, and the sun finally started to warm the earth once again. Ayanna could feel the change in the air, the soft breeze carrying the scent of fresh growth and new life. The snow had melted, and the fields around the ranch began to show signs of life, small green shoots poking through the soil, promising the return of spring. Yet despite the beauty of the world awakening around her, Ayanna's focus was entirely on what was happening inside the small home they had made. Ayanna was nearing the end of her pregnancy. Her belly had grown large, and her movements were slower now, as if the weight of the world had shifted onto her body. She had become used to the discomfort, but there were moments when the reality of what was to come overwhelmed her. She had been through so much in her life, had survived so many hardships, but this was something different. She was about to bring a child into the world, a child she had carried in her womb for months, a child she had come to love in ways she couldn't even explain. Every day felt like it was filled with a mixture of excitement and fear. She thought about the child constantly, wondered what they would look like, what kind of person they would grow up to be. Would they be strong like her people, the Apache? Or would they inherit the quiet strength Jake carried with him? She thought about the world the child would face, the world outside the safety of the ranch. Would the child ever face the prejudice and anger she had known? Would they grow up in a world that saw them as something other than human? Jake, too, had been thinking about the child, though his concerns were more practical. He had been preparing for the birth, readying the small house for the arrival of the baby. He had built a small crib, carefully crafting it from the wood he had chopped and split over the winter. It wasn't much, but it was his way of ensuring that they were ready for the baby. He had made sure they had enough supplies, food, blankets, and clothes to last through the early days. Though Ayanna had never expected to find comfort in the simple life on the ranch, she had come to cherish it. She was no longer just the lonely Apache woman she had once been. She was a wife, a mother-to-be, and a part of something bigger. She had built a life here with Jake, and despite the uncertainty of the future, she felt a sense of peace she had never known before. Jake's quiet strength, his unwavering support, had given her something she hadn't thought possible, a sense of security. The day of the birth arrived on a quiet morning in early spring. Ayanna had been feeling the familiar discomforts of labor for a few hours, but she tried to remain calm. She knew what was happening. Her body had been preparing for this moment for months. Jake had stayed close to her throughout the night, keeping watch over her and ensuring she had everything she needed. He was nervous, but he tried not to show it, knowing that Ayanna needed his strength. As the contractions became stronger and more frequent, Ayanna began to feel the weight of her fears. She had never had the chance to learn what it meant to have a proper birth. The memories of the painful past, of the losses she had suffered, came rushing back. Would she be strong enough to endure this? Would she be able to bring the child into the world safely? Jake held her hand, his grip steady, his voice calm. He didn't say much, he didn't need to. He simply stayed by her side, offering her the comfort of his presence. He had never been one for words, but in this moment, He understood exactly what Ayana needed. He didn't need to make grand promises or try to offer solutions. All he needed to do was be there. The hours passed slowly. Ayana's body was tired, and she felt as though she was losing control. But with each wave of pain, she clung to the thought of the child she was about to bring into the world. She thought of the life they would have, of the family they would become. She knew that this moment, this painful, exhausting moment, was just the beginning of something beautiful. When the moment finally came, when she could no longer deny the intensity of the pain, she squeezed Jake's hand and he helped her through it. He was with her every step of the way, his voice soft and steady, reminding her to breathe, reminding her that she could do this. And when the baby finally came into the world, crying loudly, Ayana felt an overwhelming rush of relief and joy. She had done it. She had brought this child into the world. Jake, his eyes wide with amazement, took the baby in his arms. It was a boy, a strong, healthy boy. Ayana looked at him through tear-filled eyes, and for the first time in a long while, she felt like everything she had gone through had been worth it. The child, their child, was here. And for all the hardships they had endured, for all the pain they had faced, this was the moment that made it all worthwhile. Jake looked down at their son, his face filled with wonder. He had never imagined he would be a father, and yet here he was, holding his child, a child he never thought he would have. He looked at Ayana, his heart full. She had brought this life into the world, and together they had created something beautiful, something that could not be taken away. Ayana, exhausted but overjoyed, smiled up at Jake. "He's perfect," she whispered. Jake nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "He is." In that moment, Ayana realized that everything had changed. The fear, the uncertainty, the loneliness, they were all gone. This little boy, their son, was the future. He was the hope they had built together, and he would carry their legacy into the world. As the days passed, Ayana and Jake settled into their new roles as parents. Life on the ranch was still hard, but now there was joy in it. There was laughter in their home and warmth in their hearts. They had faced so much to get to this point, but together they had created something beautiful. They had built a family, and no matter what challenges the future might bring, they knew they would face them together. Jake, who had once been a solitary man, now found himself deeply connected to Ayana and their son. He no longer felt alone in the world, and Ayana, who had once believed she was destined for a life of hardship and solitude, now felt the fullness of love and belonging. She had a family. She had a future. And as they sat together by the fire that evening with their son nestled in Ayana's arms, they knew that no matter what the world held for them, they had each other. And that in the end was enough.